Right, let's move on now and talk about something far more serious. I watched this yesterday. This was the hearing at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. There was an interim ruling. The ruling went on for a very long time indeed, and it essentially said Israel must take all measures to prevent genocidal acts in Gaza. It stopped short of ordering a ceasefire. It issued 6 provisional measures. This is South Africa that brought this genocidal case against Israel, and they include an order for Israel to take measures to ensure humanitarian access. The extraordinary thing for me was I didn't realise, but the court won't rule on the South Africans' genocidal claim for many years to come. Now, South Africa's foreign minister says the court order doesn't work without a ceasefire. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says his country will continue the war until absolute victory. Now, there's been a lot of pushback on this. This morning, the story's moved on a bit. Rishi Sunak condemned the horrific irony of the UN's top court ruling that Israel must act to prevent genocide in Gaza. Number 10 said the legal case aimed at stopping the war and accusing Israel of war crimes at the International Court of Justice was completely unjustified. Well, let's try and understand and explain a little more about this ruling. Joining us now is Andrew Eborn, barrister and broadcaster. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning, lovely to join you both again.
Good morning. Really good to see you. I couldn't think of anyone better to try and explain this, because this was brought by South Africa to the International Court of Justice. We saw the bank of judges there. The ruling took a very long time to be delivered, and the different parties in this are interpreting it differently. Can you just try and explain to people this morning?
Absolutely.
Because it's incredibly complicated.
Well, I'll unpack it, because as you always do on this wonderful show, we like to provide more light and less heat. And a lot of the media have got it wrong. They've misinterpreted what has happened. And today, as you pointed out at the beginning of your show, it's Holocaust Memorial Day, when everyone remembers the millions of people murdered in the Holocaust under Nazi persecution, as well as genocides which followed in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and Darfur. And what happened as a result of the atrocities in World War II, there was the 1948 Genocide Convention. And what that was done is basically it defines any acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And all that happened in the judgment from Judge Joan Donoghue, which the media have widely quoted, she merely reads out that relevant section of the Genocide Convention. And it's rather like saying, you shall not commit murder. Well, that's exactly what the law says anyway. They went a lot shorter than what was actually asked for, was the demand for a ceasefire. So they haven't ordered that. It will take many, many years to determine whether they find Israel guilty of genocide as defined in the convention. And that's the problem. So they talk about these immediate measures. But what they've said is you've got to come back in a month's time and tell us what you've done to effectively comply with the convention. The biggest scandal, if you like, is that Israel will now have the tarnish, if you like, of people turning around and saying, well, you're going to be tried for genocide. And it's more a political pressure rather than the legal one, because the ICJ has no teeth in terms of enforcement. It can't tell you, you must do this. All it's doing is interpreting. It's the world's court, if you like, but it has no enforcement mechanism. So what's going to happen is turn around. It's up to the countries to turn around and say to Israel, hang about, this is what it says. We're reminding you of your obligations. But they were sufficiently concerned by some of the language that came out, talking about human animals and so on and so forth, and some of the evidence that they've had to say, well, we are going to try Israel for genocide. And that's going to be interesting to see what happens politically on the world stage.
And you make a great point there, because the panel of 17 judges demanded that Israel take these measures to prevent and punish any acts of genocide in the enclave and provide more basic services and humanitarian aid. Now, in terms of and it is very complicated to understand exactly what is transpiring here. There is no doubt that this will put further pressure on Western governments to act. There is no doubt about that, and particularly those who support Israel. Now, the South African lawyers obviously cheered in celebration. They've brought this case. Rather more concerningly, Hamas also hailed the ruling, saying it would isolate Israel and expose its crimes in Gaza. Turkey and Spain also backed the court. What does that say about the response in the West?
Well, I think people interpret it in the way they want to interpret it. And as they say, it's not as some people have claimed. They haven't been found guilty of genocide. That will take many, many years. And all that the court has done, I emphasize what I said at the very beginning, all that they've done is regurgitate what the convention says about genocide. And it is word for word. And I look at the clips which have been played out of Judge Joan Donohue's judgment, and it is word for word what it says in the convention. It's Article 2 of the present convention, and it says that the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, radical, or religious group as such. And they talk about killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And all of that is word for word from the convention. So it's not a new judgment. They're not coming up with new wording. They're simply saying these are the obligations.
So are they saying there is a case to answer? Is that what they're saying?
Yes, that's exactly. In a nutshell, they are sufficiently worried about what the evidence that was presented to say that there is a case to answer about potential genocide. And that case will come before the court in the fullness of time. And I say the fullness of time because sometimes these things take many, many years. The thing, and the most important thing, is what's going to happen on a worldwide stage as a result of the words which have happened.
And can I just ask, why does it take years?
Well, it's a very good point. You've got to get all of the evidence together. It takes years and years to get both sides, well, all sides connected to bring that evidence. And there should be a quicker decision. Because the problem is, even if it had gone the other way, and a ceasefire had been ordered yesterday when the judgment came out, Israel may well say, well, we're not going to comply anyway, because they have no enforcement mechanism. So it really is what's going to happen on the worldwide stage. That's the reason for the court in the first place, is to judge these disputes, if you like, between parties and to remind people of their obligations. That's what it is. It's an effective reminder of the obligations under the Genocide Convention Act.
I mean, it's interesting. The Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, dismissed the ruling for Israel to do more to ensure it prevents any acts that could be considered genocide. So essentially Israel saying, well, we're not listening anyway, regardless of that. And he goes on to say the state of Israel does not need to be lectured on morality in order to distinguish between terrorists and the civilian population in Gaza. He also called South Africa's submission anti-Semitic. It's also worth pointing out, of course, that there is an association with South Africa, isn't there, and the Palestinian state.
Oh, absolutely. And in any judgment, you have to work out who's saying what and why. And their allegiances are very widely known. So you have to take that on board. And allegations of bias and so on and so forth have been levelled against the ICJ for many years. And there are many cases. But this is the biggest thing, as I go back to my main point, is that really is what's going to happen on the worldwide stage. Judges felt that it was sufficient evidence that they should be tried for genocide. They haven't been convicted, the trial hasn't happened, but they do think there's sufficient evidence to consider it.
And just in terms of that, the West has been largely silent. The US also urging Israel to reconsider a two-state solution, which Israel says it absolutely will not tolerate. What did you make, and maybe it's unfair to ask you, but the Rishi Sunak's comments condemning the horrific irony of the genocidal ruling? I assume he's saying essentially this was, in their words, would be an unprovoked attack which killed innocent civilians.
Well, I think, as I say, the ruling is merely regurgitating what the law says. I don't think that's unfair. They're saying they've looked at the evidence. The court rightly should consider the evidence which is before it, which it will do in the fullness of time. Biden himself has made it very clear. It's an election year. He wants the whole thing to be settled before his election, because obviously it's diverting attention and so on and so forth. It'll be the same with Rishi. So you need to look at that sort of premise. But you have to work out, the principle is exactly that. They're merely stating what the convention says and responding accordingly. And I think it's going to be very interesting how people play it, but always question that. Go back to what it actually says. Go back to the obligations anyway. And it's the analogy I made at the very beginning. If I tell you, David, you mustn't commit murder, it's not saying you're a murderer, it's just reminding you of your obligations.
Andrew, you've explained that incredibly well. Thank you. I'm very, very grateful indeed. That's Andrew Eborn, barrister and broadcaster. It's so complicated.
It is, but I think that last point that Andrew made is the crux. So it's almost like the ICJ are telling Israel not to do something, not that they have, and that's what's been lost. And I think Israel would say that they are going beyond any other army in the world to stop there being civilian casualties.
I mean, it is interesting, and of course, I mean, so the Guardian has a completely different take on this, and it says Israel is ordered by the court to prevent genocide in Gaza. Well, that's not what Andrew said. They actually said they said this is the law. Now, look, obviously, this is a huge humanitarian catastrophe on all sides. I mean, war is just awful anyway.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it was an unprovoked. Many people say it was an unprovoked attack.
Where's the court case against Hamas's genocide?
Well, right.
Genocidal acts in Israel on the 7th of October that started this. We're forgetting that. And today we have another story alongside this where the UN, members of the UN were said to have taken part in the Hamas attacks. These organisations at the top are not, you know, sitting back and looking at this from a non-biased
And then, as we said, Iran, of course, is sitting there as well, sponsoring many of these groups as well.
So South Africa and the ANC are deeply embedded with Iran. And don't forget, South Africa is a country, David, that has massive political violence.